U.S. Army's M1 Abrams is the toughest main battle tank in the free world. It is also one of the most lethal. Despite the high speeds and heavy ordnance available to aircraft, the main battle tank is still the principal weapon on a battlefield. No other system can combine such firepower, mobility, and self-protection in one package. A tank is uniquely able to take territory and hold on to it. A tank controls the advance or retreat of its nation's army. Tanks also symbolize the might of a military force. They fight their battles at ground level, eye to eye with their opponent. The dust, smoke, and fumes filling the choked air surrounding them is breathed in by friend and foe alike. Like a boxer, a tank must be able to take a punch as well as give it. They must be quick enough to dodge enemy shells, which, were it not for a tank's thick armor protection, could shatter through and splinter into its crew members. Tanks must be reliable, so they don't let their crews down when they are needed most. They must also be comfortable, because a tank could be its crew's only home for weeks or even months on end. The job of a tank platoon is simply to win the war. Nothing more, nothing less. Since the tank's first deployment on the battlefield, armored battles have determined the final outcome of many a violent struggle. Trench warfare during World War I would claim more than 800,000 lives. British naval officer Winston Churchill promoted the deployment of armored land vehicles. It was hoped that this new tank weapon would protect advancing British soldiers from the bullets of German machine guns. The tank's early successes changed the way wars would be fought, as soon as tank technology caught up with its potential. By World War II, tanks were the backbone of the European armies. In the northern Sahara Desert, German Afrika Korps Commander Erwin Rommel was ultimately defeated by British Lieutenant General Bernard Law Montgomery in their legendary tank battles. On the Eastern Front, the German Army's panzers were being outgunned by the Soviets' T-34s. Although experts in combining air and ground forces, the German military was ultimately crushed in the East by the massive deployment of Soviet tanks and artillery. This Soviet battle doctrine emphasizing huge numbers of armored vehicles is still followed today. The Soviet Army's victory at Kursk started their march into Berlin. On the Western Front, U.S.-built M4 Sherman tanks were commanded by Generals Omar Bradley, George S. Patton, and Courtney H. Hodges. In the Allies' final drive of the war, a key bridge which crossed the Rhine River at Remagen was captured intact. The fierce house-to-house battle inside the German city was over within hours. The victory at Remagen allowed Allied tank forces to push into the heart of Germany, and within a month, the war in Europe was over. Across the Pacific, U.S. Marines fought with tanks in their land battles against the Japanese Army. After a Japanese stronghold had been bombarded by aircraft and from offshore naval guns, the landed Marines and their tanks were assigned the bloody job of conquering the island. A complex system of tunnels and pillboxes meant that the final fights would be extremely close and dangerous. tanks were modified with flamethrowers to root out the most tenacious Japanese defenders. The Japanese soldier was just about the most dedicated fighting man ever put into battle. Out of 120,000 troops stationed on Okinawa, only 7,400 allowed themselves to be taken prisoner. Many Japanese who refused to give up suffered horrible deaths as they were incinerated by flamethrowers. As in Europe, tanks made absolutely clear to all which army controlled the area. They were the final decisive force in each of the war's land battles. The Soviets, who occupied North Korea after World War II, installed a communist government hostile to the United Nations Democratic Republic in the South. Less than 1 year after independence, the South underwent a surprise attack as 8 full North Korean infantry divisions invaded across the border. With less than half of the North's military strength, South Korea's army, fighting beside a handful of U.S. troops, were nearly overwhelmed before help could arrive. The Soviet-built T-34 tanks left over from World War II were still awesome weapons in the early 1950s. North Korea's Soviet-styled massive deployment of armor and infantry left the democratic forces no choice but to retreat. The communist momentum was to carry them down to the tip of the Korean peninsula near Busan. Although the few U.S. troops still able to defend fought back valiantly, most units suffered heavy casualties. The death toll in the Korean War was tragically high. The lightning-quick strikes made the evacuation of wounded haphazard at first, and without enough medevac helicopters, many soldiers died on the way to medical treatment. Commanding General Douglas MacArthur and his officers planned an ingenious landing at Incheon, near the capital city of Seoul. Troops, heavily armed M41 Walker Bulldog, and M4 Sherman tanks were convoyed to attack the communist forces from behind and cut off their supplies from the north. The panicking communists fought UN forces fiercely. Communist tank platoons were stopped dead in their tracks. The Korean War would now become one of attrition, not too different from the trench warfare of World War I. After checking a Chinese counterattack, General James Van Fleet retook the offensive and destroyed the communist forces below the 38th parallel. The joyful South Korean people thanked the UN troops after their country's liberation. The steaming hot and humid weather of Vietnam sometimes made tank crew lives miserable, but did not prevent them from getting their job done. Chrysler Corporation's M48A3 Patton main battle tank was the most powerful armored vehicle deployed by the U.S. Army and Marines during the 8 years of war here. However, this was a war without front lines and with little American regard for holding on to hard-won territory. Armored vehicles were unfortunately relegated to smaller roles. M113 armored personnel carriers would prove to be an able companion to the M48. Together in the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, they would deliver ample firepower and infantry into hotbeds of Viet Cong activity on the outskirts of Saigon. The Piedmont-like terrain of rolling hills and plains which made up the three-corps zone bordered North Vietnamese supply depots in Cambodia and provided a refuge for marauding Viet Cong guerrillas. Three Corps was also ideal terrain for traditional tank search and destroy missions. Armor won new stripes for these ops. The Communist Tet Offensive nearly overwhelmed Saigon as well as several suburbs surrounding it. In the cities and away from their jungle sanctuaries, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army regulars were ferociously pounded on by the M48s and their supporting infantry. First produced in the 1950s, the basic design of the M48 dates back to the M26 of World War II. The M48A3 was powered by a robust diesel engine. It was armed with a potent 90mm gun, which fired a variety of high explosive and armor-piercing shells. Despite the M48's inherent attributes of self-protection and firepower, air support had become the chief means of suppressing enemy attacks. The jungle and rough terrain in other Vietnamese combat zones would certainly slow down tank maneuverability, but no aircraft or helicopter could maintain its position as long or as well as the M48 Patton could. The M551 Sheraton Armored Reconnaissance Vehicle also fought in Vietnam. Its armament included a 152mm gun and missile system. The Sheraton was specially designed for low-intensity battles like most of those found in Vietnam. It was relatively small, agile, and thickly armored. Off the main road, it proved to be an adept pathfinder, but like the M48, was vulnerable to landmines. Sadly, the Sheraton was disliked by its crews. Its high-tech gun and missile system was not sorted out yet, and sometimes caused considerable discomfort to crew members when it was fired. For now, a 152mm main gun was just too big, and the Sheraton ended up spending little time in Vietnam. Life in an armored unit serving in Vietnam tested the mettle of even the toughest tank crews. The wretched temperatures and tropical sogginess of everything around them made it difficult to ride inside the vehicles when on convoy. Most soldiers preferred the cool breeze felt when riding on top, even though they risked being hit by sniper fire. Armor missions sometimes lasted for several days, so roughing it in the field was commonplace. Weary of playing hide-and-seek with the VC, crews and infantry made their tanks and APCs a home away from home until it was time to go on patrol again. unsecured thick jungle was of course hard to travel through, but more importantly, it was also extremely dangerous. A Viet Cong guerrilla would frequently sneak up quietly to a patrolling tank platoon. Once he was within a few feet of his intended target, the VC could fire a rocket-propelled grenade, or if he had time, set up a landmine and trigger it just as the vehicle passed over it. The more powerful landmines were capable of blowing up right through the armored vehicle's floor and then spraying shrapnel and spall into its victims riding inside. This was another reason why armor personnel preferred to ride on top. Without an established front line, no one could accurately predict when or where the communists would attack. The tank platoon's goal was to find them before they found you. The Viet Cong had established a thorough network of tunnels to live in and from which to conduct their military operations. The tunnel entrances were normally hidden from plain sight and almost always contained booby traps to maim the unwary. This unlucky Viet Cong guerrilla, who was killed before he could escape into the tunnels, was good evidence that more VC were probably underground. A careful search of the body for tunnel maps or documents was conducted to gain any information that might be helpful in learning what kind of military forces the tank platoons might be up against. Many tunnel systems had more than one entrance and hidden passageways, so Army experts in this specialized type of warfare were usually needed. Recalling the sights and smells of the horrific World War II Pacific Island battles between the Marines and the Japanese Army, flamethrowers were also used in Vietnam to flush out hiding enemy forces. Many environmental factors of the Vietnam War limited tank deployment, but no factor figured as much as the new Army tactics which favored airborne assaults and de-emphasized the importance of holding on to hard-won territory paid for with U.S. lives. General Dynamics M60A3 main battle tank is perhaps the final stage and crowning achievement of the basic M26 and M48 design. The M60 supersedes its predecessors with an improved suspension, track, and a computer-based fire control weapon system. A laser rangefinder aims a 105mm main gun. The main gun is fully stabilized when traveling on rough terrain for maximum projectile accuracy. The gunner's infrared sight illuminates the darkest of nights and can see through the battlefield's smoke and dust. The M60 represents conventional tank design wisdom at its peak. The 4 crew members, a commander, a driver, a gunner, and a loader can put up a strong fight 24 hours a day. The M60 weighs more than 100,000 pounds and is 23 feet in length. Its 12-cylinder air-cooled diesel engine can power the vehicle to a road speed of 30 miles per hour with a maximum range of 300 miles. The M60 can climb a 3-foot vertical obstacle and traverse an 8-foot trench. The M60's 105mm main gun is backed up with a 7.62mm machine gun and 12.7mm anti-aircraft gun. The impenetrability of its armor is classified by the U.S. Department of Defense. More than 9,000 M60s are deployed by the U.S. Army and Marines. The U.S. Marines brought their M60s to Beirut on a peacekeeping mission. Upon their arrival, they found a country which had been nearly destroyed from within by a religious civil war, and from the outside by Syria and Israel, whose futures were at stake with Lebanon's final outcome. The city had been a raging battlefield since 1975 for Christian, Muslim, and Druze militias. Syria believed that Lebanon was part of a greater Syria, separated due to a French colonial whim after World War II. Israel was after its enemy, the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was now headquartered there. The Marines arrived in the middle of this sorrow-filled trouble spot, hoping to keep any more innocent people from being killed. Helped by British, French, and Italian forces, they dug in to stay a while. Many of the Marines were landed in FMC's Amphibious Assault Vehicle 7s. These big, armored personnel carriers can cruise at sea for short distances as well as drive on land. 25 combat-ready Marines can be transported from ship to land in the AAV-7 and be protected from small arms fire, shell fragments, and flash burns. To fight back, it's armed with a 12.7 millimeter machine gun. Luckily, the Marines landed in Beirut with little trouble. The Marines were ordered to stop all warring militias and armies from committing any acts of aggression. They knew that this might be trickier to pull off than landing in a hot LZ. To defend themselves from attack, they were armed with M198 155 millimeter howitzers, mortars, and of course, M60 main battle tanks. The Marines' main headquarters was set up beside Beirut's international airport. This strategic location allowed them to protect the city's most valued asset and to monitor much of Lebanon's incoming and outgoing materiel and personnel. Once settled in, Marines were assigned to foot patrol and to stand guard at Marine bases and camps. This lonely job was boring and frustrating to some, as they had been trained for active combat, not for police duty. Nonetheless, they kept a watchful eye on the city and stood as a symbol to its residents that any more fighting would not be tolerated. Going into Beirut to patrol its streets and alleys was a fascinating experience for a young Marine fresh from Camp Lejeune. The sights and sounds of this ancient Arab city opened the door to a culture very different from that of the United States. The souks, or marketplaces, were full of life, and the Lebanese people showed no sign of giving in to the conflict around them. Destruction from the ongoing war was seen almost everywhere near the infamous Green Line. But most tragic were the poor children who were forced to grow up amidst this daily horror. The United States had asked its Marines to stop the fighting in Beirut. The militias didn't want to be stopped, so the Marines were prepared to find themselves in the middle of someone else's raging war. The crumbling rubble of property and military equipment from all sides cluttered up the city like only the waste of war can. The constant bombardments of tank and artillery shell fire have made their marks, which are sure to last for Beirut's remaining days. Whichever side wins this war will probably have nowhere left to live. The fanatical suicide attack on the Marine barracks is familiar to anyone who reads newspapers or watches TV, but less known is that new Marine heroes were made at Beirut. These men risked their lives to save the lives of some of the city's citizens and of other Marines too. They performed up to the highest standards set for them and will surely carry on the honored Marine traditions. The newest tanks carry heavier armor for more self-protection. To knock out one of these requires a special weapon like the U.S. Air Force A-10 Thunderbolt II. This attack aircraft was designed to destroy Soviet armored vehicles which have invaded West Germany. Its primary weapon is a 30mm Gatling gun which fires depleted uranium projectiles. An accurate 1-second burst is all the Thunderbolt needs for a kill. The A-10 may seem odd-looking to some, but its close air support capabilities and survivability are the best in the Air Force. Another anti-tank weapon is the air-to-surface guided missile. Stopping enemy tank forces will continue to be an important factor in any land battle. Victory or defeat will depend on it. The wars between Israel and its Arab neighbors, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, resulted in some of the biggest tank battles since World War II. The Six-Day War would make Israel's military might famous. Israeli air power and tank forces had destroyed 3 Arab armies with lightning speed. Territory in the Sinai Desert, west bank of the Jordan River, and the Golan Heights was taken and held onto by Israeli tanks. The Yom Kippur War again pitted American, British, and Soviet-made tanks in formidable battles waged from the Sinai Desert to the Golan Heights. Approximately 1,000 tanks were destroyed during the heated battles, with no side able to claim a clear-cut victory. The M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicle is a new kind of armored weapon system. Fast and highly maneuverable, it can carry troops and fight at the same time. The Bradley's blend of self-protection, troop load, and firepower from its 7.62mm machine gun give it a close-in fighting capability the U.S. Army has never had before. Its stabilized 25mm cannon can punch holes through enemy lightly armored vehicles. Top speed is 41 miles per hour. The Bradley is also fully amphibious. Its firepower is only a fingertip away. The weapon system is electronically controlled. After assessing the target data, the commander or gunner select the projectile type and firing rate. When the Bradley's gunner can't see his target because of smoke, dust, or nightfall, he can still shoot accurately by aiming with the heat-sensitive infrared sight. To kill a heavily armored enemy tank, the Bradley simply raises its tow missile twin-tube launching system. This lethal wire-guided anti-tank missile uses a 5-inch warhead to bust its way through the thickest armor. All the gunner has to do is keep the crosshairs on his target. A load of 10 tow missiles with a 2-mile range means a lot of dead tanks for one Bradley. Its relatively small size makes the Bradley a tough target for surviving enemy tanks trying to fire back. Smoke grenades make targeting the Bradley even harder. A cavalry version called the M3 carries a weapons load twice that of the M2 infantry design. Most Bradleys are the M2 versions, able to carry 7 combat-ready soldiers into battle. A Soviet BMP would be attacked from all sides if it was found by a Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. The Bradley M2 and M3 fill in the gaps between main battle tanks and armored personnel carriers. The U.S. Army wants 7,000 Bradleys to deter potential wars or fight them if necessary. Many vehicles have already been deployed to defend West Germany. The Bradley is still a new design. Its future promises to be exciting. General Dynamics' M1 Abrams main battle tank is as technologically up-to-date as an Air Force jet fighter or Navy submarine. Its composite material armor protects a gas turbine engine against both chemical and anti-tank guided weapon attacks. Manufacturing it requires the utmost care and precision. To operate it requires skill, coordination, and intelligence. The Army deploys the high-tech M1 in West Germany to counter the Warsaw Pact's numerically superior tank forces, which are stationed just inside East Germany and Czechoslovakia. Platoons of M1 tanks patrol the border in the heat of summer and the sub-zero chill of winter. Their guard is never let down. The M1A1 version has a stabilized infrared sight, laser rangefinder, and 3 optic sights. Its weapon system computer analyzes the outside wind speed, air temperature, and barometric pressure to refine the rangefinder's target trajectory. It's armed with a 120mm main gun. The high-pitched whine of their hushed turbine engines smoothly power the M1s through medieval villages and dirt roads once traveled upon by Napoleon. An armored tradition nearly 100 years old has cleared the way for the tank to become one of history's landmark instruments of war. Its symbols of strength and self-protection recall the traits of mankind's best warriors. The M1 is prepared to carry on this honor with a technology reaching into the future. Like its mission on the battlefield, the main battle tank is here to stay.